Hello, everybody. Welcome again to this session on bioethics. And last session, we looked at the third of the foundations, which is redemption. And now in this session, we're going to move on. But I'm really sad that because I'm so short of time, I cannot show the video, the fourth foundation, which is future hope. Is actually video number 7. And I'm really sad because, we do not spend enough time as Christians thinking about the future hope, about the new heaven and the new earth. And yet I am convinced that this is incredibly important, because in secular bioethics, of course, death is the end. Life is meaningless, and when death happens, everything is lost, everything is ended. But of course, it's completely different in Christian thinking, because by God's grace, Jesus has triumphed over death, and he offers the prospect of new resurrection life after the grave for every Christian. And therefore, thinking about the new heaven and the new earth, and the way that God is going to restore and recreate our humanity, is incredibly important. And for instance, it says in the Bible, when we see him, when he appears, we will be like him, because we shall see him as he is. And what we do now, the love, the compassion, the care, is never lost. One of the beautiful things, it's in Revelation 19, where it talks about the bride of Christ appearing. And it says, it was given to her at the marriage feast of the Lamb, it was given to her to wear garments, precious and wonderful. And then it says, for the wedding garments of the bride are the righteous deeds of the saints. In other words, all those little acts of compassion and care and love, which we lavish on our patients, sometimes it feels that the whole thing is wasted. The patient throws it back, or they die, and everything is lost. And what the Christian faith is reminding us, that nothing is lost, that everything that is done for God's glory and out of Christian compassion, nothing is wasted. It will, in some strange way, become part of the new heaven and the new earth. And so this is meant to encourage us to keep our eyes fixed on the future, and to allow this hope to build within us. And there's this beautiful phrase that John says, that after he says, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is, he then goes on and he says, the one who has this hope within him purifies himself as God himself is pure. So that's the Christian hope, but unfortunately we haven't time to dwell on that. Now this next video is looking at the beginning of life, particularly from Psalm 139, and asking, what can we learn about the way that God has created human life in the womb?
Hello, this is John Wyatt, and this is the first of a series of talks on the ethical issues at the beginning of life. And this first talk is really just laying some Christian foundations, our understanding of the developing human being in the womb. And of course, one of the very well-known passages is in Psalm 139, where David, the psalmist, is talking about the way that God has created him in the womb. And following John Stott's outline, there are 3 headings that I want to emphasize, and they are creation, covenant, and continuity. So first of all, the principle of creation. What is interesting in the psalm is the emphasis on the personal involvement of God in creating the unborn baby in the womb. the psalm says, "You formed me, you knit me together in my mother's womb." In fact, the literal Hebrew in verse 14, which is translated, "I'm wonderfully made," can be read to say, "I am wonderful." You know, every human being can say that they are wonderful, that God has formed them in this wonderful way. And whereas biology tends to emphasize that the process of human reproduction is a random process. You know, there are myriads of sperm, and by chance one sperm happens to enter the egg. And then following that, there are mechanical processes of mitosis, 1 cell click, 2 cell click, 4 cell click, 8 cells, and so on. What the psalmist emphasizes is that the process by which God forms the individual in the womb is both personal and purposive or intentional. That God saw you and knew you and loved you and called you into existence in your mother's womb. And that kind of very personal involvement is key to a Christian understanding of the unborn child. So the first principle is of creation. The second principle is of covenant. The language that is used in this psalm is the language of covenant. The very word "to know," where the psalmist says, "God, you know me," that word has a very intimate and profound meaning in Hebrew. It's the same word that is used of sexual intercourse when Adam knows Eve. So it's a profound covenant commitment. And when God is familiar with all my ways, that you know me, you've laid your hand on me, you saw me. So the emphasis of the psalm is not that the unborn baby knows that God is there. No, it's purely unilateral. As somebody has said, it's a unilateral covenant of grace. God reaches out to this being and knows them and loves them and calls them into existence. God is in covenant with this being in the womb. And then thirdly, there's the issue of continuity. It's interesting that David doesn't say, "Well, there was that blob in the womb which subsequently turned into me." No, he says, "That was me that you formed. That was my body that you were involved with. That was me that you saw. That was me that you wove together in the hidden place." So the psalm emphasizes the continuity of the person through all the life stages of unborn life and of childhood and on to the adulthood. So here are the three principles: creation, covenant, and continuity. We see in the New Testament, again, the significance of the unborn Jesus, who is an actor on the stage. And in that wonderful incident, which I mentioned in another series, where the pregnant Elizabeth meets the pregnant Mary. And from the outside, there are just two people in that room. But actually what Luke, the author of the Gospel, recognizes is there are four people in that room. There's Mary and Elizabeth, there's the unborn John the Baptist, there's the unborn Jesus. And John the Baptist is leaping for joy at the presence of Jesus in the same way that the lame man is going to leap for joy later on in the Gospel. So as we think about this, the unborn being, there are two important principles that we have to hold together. First of all, we have to hold together the principles of the already and the not yet. These are principles that theologians often talk about, and they apply to the developing human as well. So the being in the womb, the embryo, the early fetus, is already human, but it is not yet what it is going to be. It's in the process of becoming. Somebody said it is becoming what it already is, a human being, a human person. It's on the journey. And so we hold together the already and the not yet. I mean, it's interesting that the same is true for us as adults. So if you are a believer, you're on the journey too, but you're not yet what God has in plan for you. God has in plan for you far more wonderful things, things that no eye has seen, things that no ear has heard, things that has never entered into the heart of human beings. That's what God has planned. And so we too are on the journey. We are in the process of becoming what we already are. So the difference between me as an adult and a tiny developing human being is not that big. I mean, I'm just further along the journey, but we are both human beings in the process of becoming human, fully human. So we hold together the already and the not yet. And then the other important principle is we hold together the physical and the immaterial. We need to hold those two together as we think about this being in the womb. At a physical level, then the one-cell embryo is merely a cell. It has a nucleus, it has a cytoplasm, it has a bilipid membrane, it has all the usual kind of cellular machinery. And that's why secular embryologists say, well, what's the big deal? Why do we get so excited about this cell? It's just a cell. And it divides by mitosis, 1 cell click, 2 cells click, 4 cells click, and so on. And yet, at the very same time that there is merely a cell dividing by mitosis, God is calling into existence a unique being that he's known and loved from before the foundation of the world. So how can those two things be both true at the same time? And the honest answer is I haven't a clue, but I know that they're both true. I know that the physical and the immaterial are both true, and we have to hold them together. So, of course, this is something we find very often in Christian theology. We hear that and are taught that Jesus is fully God and fully man. How can those two things be true at the same time? They're both true. We're taught that the words of the Bible are just words of men written down, and at the same time, they're the living word of the Holy Spirit. How can those two things be true? So we hold together the physical and the immaterial. John Stott said it's God's grace which confers on the unborn child, from the moment of its conception, both the unique status which it already enjoys and the unique destiny which it will later inherit. It is grace which holds together the duality of the actual and the potential, the already and the not yet. And you know, as you track your own personhood back into the womb, and you think, this is what I looked like when I was newborn, this is what I looked like at 28 weeks, this is what I looked like at 18 weeks, this is what I looked like at 6 weeks, this is what I looked like at 3 weeks, this is what I looked like at 3 days. As you go back into your own personal history, and that's exactly what you did look like, is there any point at which you can say, this is not me, that's just a blob? Well, I don't think there is. I think right all the way back to the embryo, you recognize the continuity. You are the same person. God saw you and knew you and loved you and was calling you into existence. And that means I don't think there's any point, however far we go back, that we can reliably say there is nobody there. Of course, we know that a significant number of embryos and early fetuses fail to develop, that they may fail to implant, there may be an early miscarriage. And so in this deep mystery of a fallen world, there are many beings that don't seem to make it. But it seems to me we are called to reach out to every being in the womb in the expectation and hope that we can see that there's a person there. A question I'm often asked is, when does human life begin? And I have to say, and I hope I say it quite gently, that when people ask me that, I have to tell them, well, I'm sorry, but that's the wrong question. Because whatever we believe, it's clear that the being in the womb is both human and it's alive. Why is it alive? Well, it came out of the living body of a mother. And why was she alive? Well, she came out of the living body of a mother, and so on. So if you ask the question, when does human life begin? The answer is way back in the very origin of humanity and of the human species. Now, the question is not, when does human life begin? The question is, when is there a person in the womb that we have a duty to protect? And of course, when you put the question like that, you realize that it's not a scientific question. It's not a biological question. It's a question of philosophy and theology. When is there a person? The question of how we view the very early embryo or fetus from a Christian point of view is a controversial one, and different Bible-believing Christians have come to different positions. My own view is that however far you go back, that you cannot reliably say that there isn't a person there, and therefore even the one-cell embryo should be protected. However, other Christians have come to the conclusion that it's maybe the point of implantation, or at some later stage that is the point at which you can reliably say there is a person. And I think ultimately this is the kind of conscience issue which each one of us has to make our own decision and decide how we believe on this difficult and painful issue. And so you can't expect to find a person by using an electron microscope. That's what philosophers call a category mistake. It's not a scientific question. So how do you find a person? Well, the answer is you find a person by reaching out to them in love. So I came a good illustration of this on the internet some years ago, and here's the picture. It shows a very early ultrasound scan of a pregnancy, and the ultrasound calipers are on this tiny little blob of tissue which is precisely 5 millimeters long. Biologically, this is just a tiny little blob of tissue, but what love sees is love sees a baby, and the parents have written all over the ultrasound scan, "We are expecting a baby." In other words, as love reaches out to this being, it sees a person, it sees somebody unique and precious and significant. What I think is very interesting is that in the past, every baby had a photo album, but the photo album started at the moment of delivery. It started with that first shot after birth. Now every baby has a photo album, but it starts with a grainy black and white image of an early ultrasound scan. And people say, yeah, that's what you looked like. That was the first glimpse we got of you. So interestingly, ultrasound reinforces this concept of continuity. We find persons by reaching out to them in love. And the theologian Oliver O'Donovan put it like this: we must approach new human beings, including those whose humanity is ambiguous and uncertain to us, with the expectancy and hope that we shall discern how God has called them out of nothing into personal being. But of course, the story doesn't end there, because God himself has invaded the womb. And we're so familiar with the Christmas story that we sometimes forget how utterly astonishing and even ridiculous and scandalous it is that the God of total power and authority should turn himself into a tiny, pathetic and vulnerable human being. And so as we ask the question what God in human form looked like, then the answer is, well, he looked like an embryo. He looked like an early fetus. He took on our humanity in order to reveal himself in weakness and dependence. And it seems to me that because God was a fetus, every fetus is special, and we're called to reach out and treat every fetus with the dignity and the status that it deserves as a being, a human person being called into existence by a loving Father. So here are some questions. How does a Christian understanding of God's involvement with the unborn child contrast with secular ethical attitudes? And two, we know that a significant number of embryos and early fetuses are lost through miscarriage and spontaneous abortion. How should we think of this from a Christian perspective? And three, if God creates every being individually and lovingly in the womb, then what about cases of severe and life-threatening fetal malformation? How should we respond as Christian carers to this painful situation? Well, that's the end of this talk. Thanks very much for following me on this journey. In future talks, we're going to look at specific questions around abortion, fetal screening, and reproductive technology.
I had an enormous privilege when I was a medical student. I actually started studying physics at university, and in my first year at university, I had a kind of life crisis, a spiritual crisis. And after a lot of struggling, I really found faith and had an experience of God's love in my life. And quite soon after that, I had this experience that God was calling me. I couldn't explain why, but that God was calling me to change from physics to medicine, and that it was a kind of calling to serve Christ in medicine. And so I had to leave the university and go to London, and eventually I got a place in a medical school in London, started working as a student in London, and after a year or two, I started going to church in central London, where there was a very famous Bible teacher, John Stott. And some of you may know that name. He's written many books. And in fact, many people think he was one of the outstanding Christian leaders of the 20th century. And amazingly, by God's grace, I met him, and he invited me to meet him in his study, and he started a friendship where we walked together for 40 years as personal friends. And his modeling, what I learned from him, his love, his passion for Christ, and it's really so many of the ideas that I'm sharing now, I learned from him. But not just the theory, also seeing how he lived his life and how he lived out the truth. And so I went into pediatrics, not because there were ethical issues, but I went into pediatrics because I love children. And I found myself working in this neonatology. And it was only really after I had spent some time working in this area, I realized that all these ethical issues about technology, about whether it's ever right to switch off life support systems, about abortion, about malformation, about euthanasia, all these issues were facing me. And I just sensed that God was calling me to focus on bioethics and to try to be a voice for him. And so I've spent many years in this field, and it's been not an easy task. Many times I've wished that I could have some other calling, sometimes standing up for life, when the forces in the other direction seem so strong. It can be very painful. And I've had my own experiences of suffering. I had a very severe psychiatric breakdown after I was a consultant, because of the pressure and the work. And so I've had quite a long and difficult road. And yet, by God's grace, I have become more and more convinced about the power of Christian truth and about the wonderful ways in which he can use us. So I want to say this to encourage you. If there are some people, maybe you're a medical student, maybe you're a junior doctor, and you're looking at your life ahead and you're saying, what can I do? How can I be used by God? And the prayer that you need to pray is just, God, make me usable in your kingdom. I don't care how you use me. I don't care what you do. Just make me usable. That's a prayer I've been praying for more than 40 years. And I still pray that prayer. And, in a strange and wonderful way, God has made me usable. I never expected it, but he can use even me as a fallen man with many, many problems and issues that I struggle with. He can use me in my weakness. And if he can use me, then he can use you. And so I just ask you to pray that prayer and keep praying it. God, make me usable in your kingdom. And he will use you for his glory. And of course, this is not a new dilemma. If you think for 2,000 years of Christian history, Christians have often found themselves in desperately difficult situations. For instance, there were Christians who were in the Roman army and in the time of the early church, and they had to ask themselves, can I obey Caesar as a Christian, or do I have to desert the army? And then, of course, I may be killed. So this is not a new dilemma. And generally, as Christians, the right thing is that we should try and remain in our position. That's the principle that Paul says. He says, as much as possible, remain in the position in which God has put you. But you must have a line that you say, if I am forced to do something that is destroying me as a Christian, then I must refuse and take the consequences, whatever the consequences are, maybe. Maybe they will strip my medical degree from me, my medical license. Maybe they will put me in prison. Maybe they will attack me in many different ways. I too have had public attack because I'm standing up against abortion and other things. So we don't know what the cost will be, but in the end, we have to trust to follow Christ and to protect our hearts. It says in the Bible, protect the heart, because the heart is the wellspring of life. And if we allow our heart to become corrupted by the government force, then we are losing our integrity. And sometimes we must just stand up for Christ and take the price, whatever it is. The question is, in an IVF, if you put a larger number of embryos back into the womb, and this sometimes happens, then there is the problem of what to do if there are 4 or 5 embryos all growing in the womb at the same time. And so the standard procedure is then what is called fetal reduction. So it's simply to select some of the embryos and destroy them and just allow 1 or 2 embryos to grow. And I think the obvious solution is not to put 4 or 5 embryos into the womb. That seems to me completely wrong. And that the most number of embryos that should ever be put back is 2. I mean, to be honest, the reason why they put 4 or 5 is because they think it increases the rate of success. And often this is because of money. The higher success rate, the more money I can make. But you are damaging human lives. So in the UK now, it has become illegal to give more than 3 embryos, and normally only 2 embryos are inserted. Now, then you raise another question, or I just tell you a story. It was the middle of the day in my hospital, and I was walking down a very busy corridor. You know what a hospital corridor is like, just everybody coming and going, and no one's thinking about everything. And my mind was 100 miles away. I was thinking about some issue. I can't remember what it was. And vaguely, I'm aware that there is a heavily pregnant woman who's coming the other way down the corridor, and she is weeping. And I sort of noticed this, and there is a midwife with her. And as we pass in this very busy corridor, the midwife looks at me and she says, "Oh, it's Professor Wyatt. You should talk to Professor Wyatt." And I sort of stop. And so we find a little room. I go into the little room. And then this woman tells me, and she tells me that she has triplets by IVF. She has just been to the fetal medicine unit. They have talked to her about all the risks of triplets, of prematurity, of brain damage. And they have said, we need to do a fetal reduction. And in fact, we can do the fetal reduction this afternoon. You just need to go away and think about it. Come back this afternoon and we will do the fetal reduction. And so I talk to her and I say, well, yes, there is an increased risk with triplets. But you know, most triplets do very well. And even if there are triplets, there are very premature babies, then we have a neonatal intensive care unit. We could care for your triplets here. I show her around the neonatal unit. And then she goes away and I forget about it. And then some months later, I'm working in the neonatal unit and somebody says, "There's somebody here to see you." And so I go to the door of the neonatal unit and there she is with her husband, and there are 3 babies in her arms. And I realized that God had prepared that. It says in the Bible that God has prepared in advance good works for us. And it wasn't anything special about me. It was just the fact that I was usable. And so God could make that coincidence happen, that as we walked down that corridor, the coincidence happened. I met her, and because we met, those 3 babies survived. And she was saved from the terrible agony and the guilt of destroying her own baby. Now, the final thing just to say is, and I understand, Doctor, the issue you have. How can I get a training in reproductive technology if I am also expected to do fetal reduction? Because that's what happens in my hospital. And this is a terrible dilemma, and I understand it. And it is the dilemma that is often called cooperation with evil. Because we are living in a fallen world, sometimes we can't avoid cooperating in some way with evil. And I think in the end, everybody must follow their own conscience. I cannot tell you what is right and what is wrong, but it would be possible for you to go and speak to your senior doctors and say, look, I'm really committed to reproductive technology. I want to be the best doctor I can, but I cannot do the fetal reduction because of my conscience. Can you, I'm happy to do some more duties. I'm happy to work extra time, provided you will allow me to follow my conscience and not to do the fetal reduction. And so we try to find a better way where we can protect our own integrity as Christian doctors. I hope that's helpful. Yeah, well, the question of IVF again is very difficult, and I'm sorry I've said this many times. If you're interested, then there are other videos in this series which deal with IVF in more detail, and also on my website, johnwyatt.com, you can find more articles. But in principle, I feel that IVF, where you take the sperm of a husband and you take the egg from the wife and you join them together and you put it back in the womb, although there are many problems with IVF, I cannot say that that is wrong. Although some Christians are totally against IVF, my own view is that provided the man and the woman are married and you only use the sperm and the egg, then in some way you are restoring what God has intended. But if you take something like egg donation or sperm donation or surrogate pregnancy, then you are breaking the link between the man and the woman, the husband and the wife, and the creation of the child. And I think that is wrong. So I would agree with IVF, but only in the case where the husband's sperm and the wife's egg is being used. And if it's not possible for the couple to have a couple in that way, then I would strongly suggest that they would explore other options such as adoption to care for a child who already exists. Question, and it's an obvious question, isn't it? But it's very important to understand there is a huge difference between kidney donation and sperm donation. Why is that? Because let us just think about the way that what happens when you have a baby. So let me just speak personally. I was a junior doctor and a single man. And then I met this wonderful lady called Celia, and we fell in love and we got married. And because I was a unique person and Celia was a unique person, the combination of John and Celia was completely unique. The world had never seen anything as wonderful as the combination of John and Celia. But for 5 years, our love was a kind of hidden thing. Nobody could see our love. It was just in our hearts. But after 5 years, something very, very strange happened, because the unique combination of John and Celia turned into a baby. And written into the DNA of our babies is the love between John and Celia. Because this baby, this child, who's now a grown man, in fact, we have 3 of them, they are like an incarnation of our love. The physical structure of our children is the love between John and Celia. And you know, if our children go on and have other children, and they have, and we have a grandchild, written into the DNA of our grandchild is the combination of John and Celia. And long after John and Celia have died, their love will continue to go down the gene pool, because DNA is the way that a love between a man and a woman is turned into a baby. So every baby is a love child. It is a physical incarnation of the love between the man and the baby. So can you see why sperm donation breaks the connection between the love and the baby? it interferes with this combination. And that's why sperm donation or egg donation, because they are gametes, because they lead to the formation of another human being, it is not the same as an embryo donation. When you donate sperm, you actually change the gene pool on into history. When you donate a kidney, you don't change the person. And so that's, if you like, is a long answer, but it's the reason why I believe that gamete donation or surrogacy is not in accordance with Christian principles. I think what the doctor is talking about here is what is normally called intersex, which is not the same as what is called transgender in the West. So intersex is where a baby is born, and although the genetics is clear that they are either a male or female, when you look at the genitalia are not clear. It's not clear whether this is a male genitals or a female genitals. And in the UK, this is a very rare but known condition. So I'm very interested that the doctor says this is quite common in Pakistan, and I wonder whether this is because of genetic relatedness between the mother and the father, and therefore some genetic autosomal recessive conditions are more common, or whether it's due to some other cause. But I think in this situation, we would want to say, this is still a precious human being. This baby is a baby made by God. We don't understand why this problem, this condition of intersex is there. And we should try to find the best medical treatment for this. It's usually a decision has to be made in what gender the baby is raised. The best thing normally is to follow the genetic sex, so that you would do a genetic analysis. And if the genetic analysis, for instance, shows that this is a girl, even though there may be virilization, that often the best thing is to raise the child as a girl. And then when she is older, it's possible that some kind of hormonal or surgical treatment could be carried out. I just want to point out this is different from what is happening in the West, where we are having the phenomenon that is called transgender. This is where someone who is biologically completely normal, a healthy baby, a healthy child, a female or a male, is suddenly saying, I'm no longer a girl, I wish to be regarded as a boy, and I'm going to have hormonal and surgical treatment to change my genitals, to change, for instance, to change my sex. Now that's a different phenomenon from this medical condition of intersex. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we bow before you. You are the God of creation. We are reminded that you saw us, each one of us, when we were a tiny little speck in our mother's womb. You loved us, you knew us, you called us into existence. And it says in Psalm 139, every day that was written in our lives was written in the book. You knew everyone. And so you knew this day, Lord. You know we would meet by Zoom in these very strange circumstances. And you know that we would be talking like this. And so we worship you. And as we look into the future, we pray that you would guide us. We want to be usable. Lord, make us usable in your kingdom. Help us above all to show the Lord Jesus, whatever the problems we face, whatever the challenges, whatever the difficulties, we want to be usable. And to you be the glory now and forever. Amen.